Welcome to this second lecture covering Chapter 14 of our textbook. This chapter relates to safety and security issues in the hospitality industry. And we have four topics that we're covering in this chapter. The first two topics we covered in the first lecture. We discussed the importance of having a safe and secure environment, and we discussed the types of programs that you're likely to need to develop and implement to support that safe and secure environment. Now, in this second lecture, we're going to cover the types of crimes that oftentimes affect hospitality businesses and also crisis management programs generally. So let's get started. So here we're ready for our third topic, crimes against hospitality businesses. We have three kind of buckets that we're going to focus on when we talk about crimes against hospitality businesses. This is not intended to be an exhaustive look at this subject, but just to kind of touch on some categories and some issues that should be in the minds of hospitality managers. The first is customer theft of services. This is obviously when a customer doesn't pay for a service that he or she receives. For example, the customer walks out on his or her dinner tab at a restaurant, or walks out on his or her hotel charges. There are lots of different approaches to reducing the likelihood of this happening, but an important approach is going to be to require payment information from the beginning of the transaction. So when the a guest checks into the hotel, you take credit card information. Even if that guest says, well, I'm going to choose to pay for the hotel with cash, by getting that information about the credit card, you're preserving your options. Yes, of course, you can always cancel the credit card authorization and accept cash instead. But when you have that credit card information, you are in a more secure place in the event that the customer does not voluntarily consent to pay. Even when you don't require payment information, if you require some kind of identification, a driver's license or something like that, then at a minimum you're in a position to be able to identify this individual to the police or to other officials to make sure that they are identified and required to pay. Also, that individual now knows that his or her identity is available to you, and so it increases the likelihood of that individual paying. Many of these tools are not so much focused on how to handle the situation when the person doesn't pay. Instead, we're focusing on encouraging the avoidance of that problem entirely. So if the guest knows that you have his credit card information, he's not going to walk on his bill. It's very unlikely. When the guest knows that you know who he is, he's going to pay, or he's going to choose not to do business there. And so most of these strategies are designed to reduce the likelihood. It's kind of like, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. No technique is going to be 100% successful. There's still going to be some theft, but you're going to be able to reduce those numbers. And hopefully the thefts that you do experience are not going to be as financially devastating for you as they might have otherwise been. A related concern to the theft of services issue is fraudulent payment. The consumer appears to pay, but he really doesn't. This can happen with credit cards. It can happen with cash. It can happen with personal checks. With credit cards, the credit card might be stolen, for example, or the person may not have a sufficient credit limit to actually permit the credit card company to accept to qualify as payment for that particular transaction. There's a few strategies here to avoid this possibility. One is, of course, to get that credit card information and the authorization before the transaction happens. While this isn't common in most restaurants, I've seen this at the movie and dinner type places. When you place your orders, the servers will also take your credit card. And they present it as kind of a customer service thing. Hey, it's easier to give you the credit card now before the movie started. But more likely than not, they're also concerned about people walking on their credit card bills. And so it's also a security measure. As well as a customer service. And so you want to get that information from the beginning. You want to be able to get the authorization. And you also want to consider using a credit card authorization service to confirm that this credit card is good and that the transaction is going to be honored. When you're dealing with cash, probably your greatest concern is with counterfeit currency. There are, well, that's one category. There's another category too. So let's talk about counterfeits first of all. There are pins that you can buy to check to make sure that the currency is not counterfeit. There are also other aspects of currency to look for to see that whether or not it is counterfeit or not. This can be an area that training can really be of benefit. Possibly even law enforcement is going to be in a position to assist with this. Now, actual counterfeiting is a Department of the Treasury, a federal government role, more so than a local law enforcement role, but still it is a concern for law enforcement at all levels. Another way that cash can be used fraudulently would be when there is some kind of intentional distraction of the cashier so that the cashier doesn't actually receive the payment that the cashier thinks that he's receiving. I think back to the movie. It's a very old movie at this point, but it had Tatum O'Neal in it. I think it was called Paper Moon. And in that movie, she's probably about an 8 or 10-year-old kid. She is running a scam with her father. They're both con artists. And in the scam, what she does is her father beforehand makes a purchase and with a $20 bill. And on the $20 bill is written a little note, something like, "Love, Aunt Maybelle." And the idea is, anyway, so this $20 bill is deposited at the time that he pays this $20. Neither the cashier nor the father make any comment about that notation. Probably neither one notice it really. Then a few minutes later, the daughter walks in, and she is not, to the knowledge of the cashier, associated with that earlier man, even though in reality they're father and daughter. So she goes in and she pays for an item with a $1 bill or $5 bill or $10 bill. Anyway, so she's waiting for her cash, and the cashier gives her the correct change, but she complains, "No, you're not giving me the right change. I gave you a 20." And the cashier is saying, "No, you didn't. You gave me a whatever it is that you in fact gave me." Well, this 8 or 10-year-old kid, very cute little girl, is crying and carrying on, and she goes, "I know I gave you the 20 because it was for my great Aunt Maybelle. And she even wrote a note on it wishing me a Merry Christmas or Happy Birthday or whatever." And of course, the cashier's like, "No, no, no, you didn't do that." Well, she finds the top $20 bill in her cash register does have that message on it, and then she begins to question herself. Well, maybe the kid did give me a 20, and so she ends up making change for the transaction as if she had in fact gotten a 20. So you can see how that's a way to fraudulently to defraud the place of business through making a payment. So you always want to make sure that when you're handling the cash transaction that the cashier isn't distracted, is focused on the transaction, doesn't have more things going on than there ought to be, is single-minded on that particular task, and ought to be suspicious of any type of transaction or any type of interruption or distraction that happens at the time, because it may be a very conscious ploy on the part of the payer. Finally, of course, personal checks can be hot. They can be checks that are not going to be returned for insufficient funds. Most businesses have a process for authorizing those funds. They require certain identification, perhaps a driver's license, It may be that the cashier is supposed to confirm the picture on the driver's license and the driver's license number, and they may not be permitted, for example, to accept checks that aren't pre-printed with the name and the address of the account holder. Other checks may be also relevant. You want to make sure that your cashiers are appropriately trained on the authorization procedures. You want to make sure that the authorization procedures that your business uses are consistent with kind of best practices in this industry. And of course, there's a check and balance here. Authorization procedures can help reduce the likelihood of getting stuck with a bad check, but they can also slow down the progress of lines, and they can, to some extent, be considered offensive to the guests. What, you don't think I'll pay? What, I have to show you my driver's license? I don't want to give you my driver's license number. That's personal information. So you have to also balance the concerns about customer service with the check writing concerns as well. So there's a balance there, and again, it's the place of the business, not the cashier, to decide where that balance comes down. You want to have the procedures that the cashier is going to follow, and make sure that they are consistently followed by those individuals. So we've talked about theft of service and fraudulent payment, and these of course are by consumers, by our guests. But there's a third category, and this is when our employees are the criminals. Unfortunately, this is a very serious risk that businesses have, and hospitality businesses are not exempt from this risk at all. Internal theft is a major, major liability for businesses today. It's one of the reasons why we want to consider using those background checks. And so you want to have checks in place to reduce the likelihood of these particular tasks. We'll talk about embezzlement in a few minutes. This is, of course, a situation in which an employee who is authorized to handle certain funds uses those funds not for the benefit of the business, but for his or her own personal benefit. It's a very serious crime, and it obviously results in a significant loss for the business. But let's look right now at another issue, and this is the theft of community property. In some sense, most of us are guilty of some of this. Who among us hasn't taken home a paper clip or run a photocopy or taken a pencil or pen home from the business? Maybe inadvertently, maybe on purpose. Usually businesses consider small acts like that as kind of just a cost of doing business, and they don't really probably put it in the category of theft. But certainly you can escalate the matter pretty quickly, and you are getting into theft type situations. So how do you address those issues? Well, of course, one way is by effectively screening applicants. Through a criminal background check, you can screen out some of those individuals, but you don't want to rely exclusively on that, because there's a lot of thieves out there that have never been caught, or if they have been caught, they haven't had a conviction on their record that would show up in a criminal background check. And so just relying upon that as your only means of sorting through your population is probably not adequate. You'll want to talk with them, get to know them. Now, none of us has a truth serum we can administer, or a particular magic question that we can ask that will sort through. There are certain businesses that have questionnaires that employees will answer that are designed to get at the likelihood of a particular person being a thief. But those can raise important questions about privacy and about effectiveness, and they can also tend to discriminate against certain ethnic and racial groups. So those can be definitely something to consider doing, but you will also want to run those types of programs by your attorney to make sure that they are good choices in your particular jurisdiction. But whether or not you decide to take those tests, or what kind of criminal background check you choose to do, you'll want to also ask good questions of your employees and see how they answer them, to see whether they are a good match for you in this particular area. It's also a good opportunity to let the potential employees know how seriously you consider this issue. An employee who is prone to be thinking that he or she is going to engage in theft isn't going to volunteer that information, obviously, during the interview. But if you emphasize that this is an important concern for your business, he or she may be less likely to come to work for you and may want to work for a business that is a little bit more apathetic in that area. So part is getting information from the applicant, but part is informing the applicant of your anti-theft culture. And of course, you want to continue the development of that culture throughout the employment circumstances. Now, there's lots of ways to talk about this. Probably the best way is just to talk about it, to say this is important to us, and to talk about it regularly, to talk about it consistently, and to talk about how you address these matters, how you discover it. You don't want to give away all of your secrets, but some of the ways that you use to discover it, so that those individuals who are on the fence, who are considering criminal behavior, are likely to give it a second thought. And those who are seriously considering criminal behavior may choose to go to work for another employer who isn't as focused upon this. And then finally, you want to reduce the opportunities to steal. You want to have checks in place, cameras in the right places, requiring 2 people to do a particular task, requiring people to initial and sign out and do things along those lines. Again, best practices here can really help you to make sure that the process that you're following is a wise one for your particular type of business, given the technologies that are available. So let's talk a little bit more about embezzlement, or more specifically, how bonding can reduce the risks to you from embezzlement. So what is a bond? Well, it's an agreement that you enter into with an insurance company, in which an insurance company agrees to pay the employer in the event that a particular employee embezzles or causes a financial loss, steals something. Now, the insurance company is going to do something along the lines of a criminal background check to see if the person is bondable to begin with. Bonds are oftentimes used for employees who handle sensitive information or sensitive assets of significant value. Obviously, they're not free, so you don't necessarily need to bond everybody in a place of employment, but it's definitely something worthy of consideration. So now we've talked about the importance of having a safe and secure environment, how to develop and implement and adjust programs relating to these topics. We've discussed a few of the crimes that can affect a hospitality business, and now we're ready for our last topic, which is crisis management programs in the hospitality industry. So what is an emergency plan? Well, pretty obvious. I don't think there's a lot of question mark here. It's the bundle of procedures that you have to respond to any particular crisis. And of course, we had talked about crises before. We had a long list in the first section of this chapter. So let's talk again, and again, we talked about this same process. Well, many of these processes, we didn't talk about media relations before, but we talked about that pre-crisis planning. We talked about how we need to develop that emergency or that crisis plan. We talked about the various components to that, the various steps that we'd want to take. We're not going to go over all those elements again, but here are just a couple of ideas to keep in mind. You've probably heard the acronym KISS, keep it simple, silly, or some people say some other word for it, but we'll keep it a little bit nicer. Keep it simple, silly. This is meaning that you don't want to add unnecessary complications. Keep in mind that when people are in a crisis, they are in a crisis. The adrenaline is pumping. They're not necessarily able to concentrate or remember a lot of details. And so you want the most important parts of the plan to be the ones that are definitely followed. If you have 100 steps in your program, and you're not highlighting the ones that are most important, you might find that lots of important steps are skipped over because of the adrenaline rushing. So a plan that is simple that is relatively short is perhaps the better plan than one that covers every single imaginable base but is tremendously long. You want to have your program in writing for lots of reasons. For one thing, it can be referred to during the crisis. People can pull out that document and look at it. For another thing, it creates a paper trail. If something doesn't go well during the crisis situation, and somebody sues, you can say, hey, but we did have a plan. Okay, it's true, it wasn't followed exactly, but at least we did have a plan. It can also make sure that everybody is singing from the same hymnal, so to speak. Everybody's on the same page, literally, and that can help add to consistency. So when I am the manager, I'm saying, hey, have you done item number 4? They know what you mean by item number 4. They can refer to your list. It also allows you to have a paper trail if you have to take disciplinary action. Let's say that Bob didn't do plan aspect number 6 of the plan, even though according to the plan he was assigned that task, and you want to dismiss Bob as a result. It's a lot easier to defend the dismissal when you have a document that Bob had access to for that particular situation. Obviously, you'll want to distribute it to all of the employees, and not only distribute it, but also make it clear to them where to find it in that crisis situation, and ideally have it in a place that they can quickly and easily get access to it. For example, housekeeping employees perhaps need to have that in their cart, not down in the laundry area that might be several floors away from where they are at the time of the crisis. Almost as important as having that plan is practicing it. Things can look good on paper, but don't work out in actual day-to-day events. You think that things will only take this long to do, but it ends up taking a lot longer. Or you would think that number 2 should be done before number 3, but you realize as a practical matter, no, number 3 ought to happen before number 2. Only through practice can you tweak the plans in those ways. Also, of course, practice gives people an opportunity to actually experience the crisis to some extent. Obviously, it's a fake crisis, but still, some of the elements of that experience will still be there. And so doing it once is in some sense better than reading about it 100 times. So you definitely want to practice the skills. During the actual crisis, hopefully you won't ever face a crisis, but if you do, here are some things to think about. Of course, the most important thing, again, is always guest and employee safety. The safety component comes before the security component all the time. That's important to the management response. It's also important to the staff response. We protect people before property. And you know what? People even includes people who aren't doing the right thing, who perhaps are obstructing. Perhaps they're the bad guys in the situation. Their safety is still more important than property. Human life is what comes first. As we are protecting individuals, we also need to remember to contact the appropriate law enforcement aspects. I'm saying contact 911. Sometimes it will be 911. Sometimes it won't be that kind of emergency. So we might call the non-emergency number of the police or the non-emergency number of whatever governmental agency it might be. But we'll want to do that. That, of course, can increase guest and employee safety. But sometimes you have to do guest employee safety before you do the 911. So there's some judgment involved there. Once you've done those steps, and of course these are going to be aspects of your emergency plan, you'll want to implement the rest of your emergency plan. And as always, you're going to want to document the response. Now, it may not be possible to document everything in the midst of the crisis, but you'll want to do it as quickly after as possible. Again, it can help you see where there were opportunities to do better if the program is tweaked or people receive more training. And it's also important in terms of managing the legal risks that may have arisen because of the crisis. Of course, guest response are going to vary. You're going to have some heroes in your group. You're going to have some incompetent people. You're going to have some people who are difficult. All kinds of people can fit into that mix. And it's going to be unpredictable who's going to respond in what way. But even when a person is difficult and unpleasant and possibly a problem in and of himself or herself, the hospital always should continue, when I say the hospital, I mean the staff and the management, should continue to express concern for all of the guests' well-being and try to make it as sincere as possible and make that be a strong note in the way that we interact with guests. We'll talk about media relations in a bit. It can be an important topic depending upon what the particular crisis is. Then, of course, after the crisis is over, then you'll want to evaluate, again, looking at that documentation to see how can we improve our plans. How can we improve how we practice it? How can we improve how we implement it? Where did we excel? How can we improve upon that? Where did we maybe not meet our expectations? What can we do to address that issue? Almost every plan can be improved upon, especially after you've been tested. And so that's a good opportunity to tweak and to revise. So let's talk about that press element. We have a few slides on this one. What is a press release? Well, it's an official statement made by either an individual or most likely in this case the organization that is distributed to the media and also can be distributed to other parties. Dealing with the press can be a very frustrating experience. In my role working for large corporations, I oftentimes dealt with the press, and I can tell you that it was rare that a member of the press got the story really correct. They may have gotten aspects of the story correct, but almost inevitably they got pretty important parts just flat out wrong. And most of the time it really wasn't because the press wanted to get it wrong or that they had a particular agenda that they wanted to harm me or my business. They just have a lot of data to deal with and not a lot of time to process it. And so oftentimes it gets kind of turned around. And so don't be surprised at all if you find that while you were clear as could be, the press has somehow mangled the message, gotten the facts wrong, and turned a story into the story that should have been presented in one way into a story that's presented in a different way. The bottom line is you can't control the press. And if you focus so much on doing that, you're just going to frustrate yourself, pull yourself away from tasks that you actually can be doing, and you're likely to antagonize the press. You want to be positive, you want to be professional, and you want to show your concern for your guests and your employees. Those are the themes you want to advance. Be the best hospitality manager you can be in the circumstances and let the press do their job to the extent that they're going to, which you can't control. Here are some ideas about how you may want to communicate with the press. Just so you'll note, this is slide 27. You may find this useful to refer to. First thing is be professional, and this means be professional in all aspects. You want to be dressed professionally, and that doesn't necessarily mean a suit. If you're in the middle of a hurricane, I don't know if suit's necessarily what you need to be in. But you'll want to conduct yourself professionally. And what I mean by that is, you won't want to smell of alcohol or beer. You won't want to be chewing gum. You won't want to be swearing. You will want to present yourself calm, cool, collected. You may be stressed. The circumstances may be less than ideal, but you want to, as much as possible, communicate that level of professionalism. When it's appropriate, you want to update the press. The press wants more information, and that's usually a source of frustration for the press that they're not getting as much information as they want. Getting them on your side by providing them the information they need can be an important tool that you can use to help shape the story. On the other hand, talking to the press when you're not ready to talk to the press, talking to the press when you don't have the full story or you start saying things that you aren't sure are true is a sure path to disaster. So While you want to update the press regularly, you want to make sure that before you talk to the press, you have good answers to give. You want to identify yourself and your position. You want to do this consistently, giving them your name, spelling your name, giving the name of your business, spelling the name of the business, giving your title. And you'll want to share that information more than once, most likely, to make sure that is communicated. If there are other people that you're introducing to the meeting or the uh, mechanism that you're using to share this information, you will want to provide the same pieces of data on those individuals as well. If you're speaking, you'll want to speak clearly and calmly. This is especially important if what you're saying is going to be on the radio or the newspaper, but it's also important if the reporter is simply taking notes or recording your notes. Maybe it's the newspaper reporter. You'll want to speak clearly and calmly. You'll want to enunciate clearly. You'll want to pause so that the person taking notes can get the notes down as correctly as possible. You may need to say things more than once. That's a good idea because things can really get turned around really quickly. Here's an important thing. You want to avoid speculation. You may think you know how a particular situation happened, and you may think that the way it happened is a really good fact for you. So you might be there saying, oh, well, this is what happened. Or even, I think this is what happened. And it may end up that you are completely wrong. Better to not volunteer that speculation than to volunteer speculation and end up having egg all over your face. So stick to the facts as you know them. Don't engage in speculation or rumors or assumptions or probably scenarios. You'll always want to express concern for affected people. You want to do it sincerely. You won't want to make it sound like a bunch of attorneys wrote your expression of concern. You'll want it to be not just the guests, but also the employees, and not just their personal safety, but their assets and things along those lines. But you want to focus on people's personal safety and well-being. And you'll want to come across very strongly on this point. Repeat it several times. It should be a talking point that you return to again and again. You'll want to not release the names of victims or suspects. You don't necessarily know who did what, and you don't know that victims want to have their names released. They may want to share that information with family and friends and others before it's out there in the press. And so you want to respect the privacy of individuals. Even if you're sure that Bob is guilty of the crime, don't be saying his name. You also don't want to say no comment. Now, you may well have no comment, but you'll want to do it in a different way. You want to explain that you aren't in a position right now to add anything further, and you may want to explain why. For example, you might say, listen, I'd love to speak with you at greater length at a later time. Unfortunately, at this time, there's an investigation going on. The last thing that I want to do is interfere with the progress of that investigation. That's a way to say no comment that says no comment without saying no comment. Boy, this next one is so important. Practice your answers beforehand. When I was with JCPenney, one of the things that I had the privilege of doing was going to a retreat where I worked hands-on with media types about how to respond to the press. And literally we went through hours and hours of practice. And one of the big things taken from that is you have to practice. You have to practice a lot more than you ever thought you would have to practice. And one of the things that was emphasized was making sure that every time you answer a question, you include your message in that answer. So when they ask you something like, what time did the accident happen? You could say, at about 4:15, the fire broke out, and we continue to be very concerned about the welfare of our guests and our employees. Our thoughts and prayers are with them right now. You may say, well, they didn't ask you how you felt about your guests and employees. Well, that's true. I answered the question, and I continued immediately back to my theme. And again, a very likely theme you're going to want to use is going to be concern. And so I'm going to put that with my answers, perhaps with all of my answers. If it's an interview with the press, they're going to cut and paste. They're going to take this little snippet here and that little snippet here. And so I want to make sure that the message that I want to convey is included in as many of those snippets as possible. So that's a strategy. Think about the 2 or 3 things you really want your listening public to know about, and attach that piece of information, that theme, to all of your answers. You'll also want to do other things like look the camera in the eye as opposed to the person you're speaking to. Or you can look to the person you're speaking to, but maintain a positive and open demeanor with that person. Lots of different approaches to consider. If you have notice ahead of time that you're going to be involved in this press situation, getting media training is not a bad thing. It can really help you in being more effective. Obviously, you don't always know when it's going to happen, but just keeping in mind that you need to practice those answers. Even 20 or 30 minutes of going over some practice questions and answers with your staff can be a really positive thing. As I said before, it's inevitable that the press is going to get some facts wrong. That's just a given in most of these cases. When that happens, you'll want to get back with the press and explain the parts of the story that weren't correct and help them get to the right information. It's really tempting, especially when you've been so stressed because of all the things that have been going awry in your life through this crisis. You're tired, you're frustrated, maybe you haven't slept much, to kind of take a little bit of your hostility out on the press. Well, you don't want to do that, though. You want to consider the press a resource for you, and you want to keep them a resource for you. So you want to talk respectfully and professionally with them. But that doesn't mean that you need to not bring to their attention when they've made an error. So you'd call up the person and say, "Hey, Larry, I read your newspaper article about our situation here, and I noticed these 3 facts that weren't correct. I'm wondering if you'd be able to uh, make these corrections in the next story that you run on this particular situation." He or she may or may not agree with you that the facts that you think are wrong, but he's likely to at least give you the opportunity, listen to you, and hear what you have to say. The calmer you are, the more professional you are, the more likely you are to be successful. Off the record, this is a term for when you talk with the newspaper reporter and the newspaper reporter agrees not to quote you. This can be an opportunity to get some background information, but at the end of the day, you ought to assume that when you're talking with a newspaper reporter, it is on the record, and that the information that you're sharing can well end up in the record, in the newspaper, on the record. So while there's nothing wrong with going off the record, it's not a license to say just whatever you want about a particular circumstance. We spoke before, let me flip back here for a second. We spoke before about a crisis response. One of the things I think that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle is that when the crisis is over, it doesn't mean all the problems are over. Depending upon what the crisis is, let's say it was a robbery or a fire or something along those lines, it is possible for people to be profoundly affected by that. Sometimes people have a severe reaction to an event that has happened, and that can cause all kinds of physiological and psychiatric issues to arise. So it's not unusual for guests, for staff, even for you, the manager, to respond with a PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of that circumstance. You ought to be on the lookout for those symptoms when they do arise, and refer folks to the assistance they need so that they can go back to being productive members of society. They can be happy and comfortable again in their own skins and in this particular working environment. So it's definitely something to flag. It's not a sign of weakness when people experience these types of situations. It's a sign of strength when they're able to address them. And when you can help them, you're going to get that much more buy-in from those employees, that much more support, and that much more appreciation. So it's a win-win when you actually assist your staff in that way. Now we've gone through all 4 of our issues. We've talked about the importance of a safe and secure environment. We've talked about how to develop programs that are going to increase the chances of maintaining that environment. We've talked about a few types of crimes that can affect the hospitality business. We talked about how we're going to manage that crisis once it happens, with special emphasis upon the involvement that we might have with the press. And this concludes our presentation. If you have any questions about this topic, please feel free to email me, or even better, stop by my office so we can discuss it in more detail. As always, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.